And now it's time for news from around the world. And meanwhile in El Salvador, we are apparently seeing what should have been the expected, obvious outcome of our immigration policy over the past decade or so. We know that when people come here seeking our help, saying they're fleeing domestic violence, gang violence, political persecution, I'm inclined to say that they're probably not lying about that. And if we send them home, that can have negative ramifications. So I want to talk about those ramifications. Not for all countries, this data specifically for El Salvador, coming from Human Rights Watch. They say that while Salvadorans have asylum recognition rates as high as 75% in other Central American nations and 36.5% in Mexico, the US recognized just 18.2% of Salvadorans as qualifying for asylum from 2014 to 2018. And that means that during that time, we then deported with Mexico 213,000 Salvadorans. A little bit more than half of that comes from the US. So that more than 80%, what ends up happening to them? Well, Human Rights Watch identified and investigated 138 cases of Salvadorans killed since 2013 after deportation from the US. Those came from press accounts, court filings, talking to family members, officials in the area. This is not an official tally. Their research suggests that the number of those killed is likely greater, and the damage done extends beyond those who can be reliably identified as having been killed. It's much harder to identify because they're almost never reported to the press or authorities, but they identified or investigated over 70 instances in which deportees were subjected to sexual violence, torture, and other harm, usually at the hands of the gangs or who went missing following their return. This is obviously what is going to happen when people come to you saying they're fleeing either assault, rape, murder, and then you send them back to that environment. We cannot be surprised by this, but hopefully we can in the future change our policies so that this doesn't continue to happen. Meanwhile in the UK, at least when it comes to automobiles, they are taking the climate crisis pretty seriously. Britain is gonna ban the sale of new gasoline and diesel cars by 2035, 5 years earlier than originally planned. And for the first time, hybrid vehicles will also be covered by the ban, which is interesting, I guess, but also kind of obvious. They use gasoline, so how are they not included in the ban in the first place? But for many people, this is still going to seem like an extreme step. I mean, 2035, that's like next year, isn't it? And it seems like to get rid of all new gasoline car sales is pretty big. But honestly, if you're gonna say that you're taking this seriously, if you actually believe that things are as bad and are gonna get as bad as it seems like they will, then you're gonna have to take bold stances. You're gonna have to make major changes. And one world leader does recognize this, but this is gonna be a real trip. So the quote is, "We have a responsibility to our planet to lead." And you know who said it? Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Yes, because in the UK, Boris Johnson is a reprehensible monster of a man. But he accepts climate change, at least for the most part. Like, their monsters are so much more reasonable than our monsters. The accelerated timetable drew immediate pushback from automakers, which raised concerns about the lack of clarity on whether the government would continue to subsidize sales of electrical vehicles, the lack of charging infrastructure, and potential job losses. And yes, you cannot simply ban the cars and that's it. You have to subsidize their purchase. You have to help people switch over potentially not to electric cars, but to public transportation. You have to provide the charging infrastructure. The government needs to be an integral part of that, but it needs to happen. And this is the sort of step that might seem extreme initially, but I think more and more countries are gonna move in this direction. Meanwhile, bad news for that penguin in Antarctica. We're gonna focus, we know that there's a lot of issues in terms of climate change with Antarctica, a lot that could go wrong, that could be devastating for coastal cities around the world. Let's talk about one cavity that was discovered under Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica. It's 6 miles long and 1,000 feet deep. It's supposed to be ice, but it's been lost, and that represents a loss of 14 billion tons of ice. This is one glacier in one area of West Antarctica. And to give you an idea of how significant its loss over time has been, meltwater from that one glacier accounts for 4% of the entire global sea level rise that we have seen as we've been recording that over the past few decades. But how significant it is in the future, if that one glacier was to be lost, and it's expected right now that that's gonna happen in 50 to 100 years, assuming things don't accelerate, that could raise global sea levels by 2 feet. Not if Antarctica melts, not if West Antarctica falls into the sea. If this one glacier does, that's 2 feet of rise everywhere in the world. That is the complete destruction of a number of coastal cities. That is hundreds of millions of people who will then need to flee. And I got news for you. If Thwaites Glacier goes under, a lot of other parts of Antarctica are as well. Absolutely devastating, and we definitely have to take it seriously, as at least in this case, the UK apparently is. For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.